Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have all of you here in the audience today. We're so excited for you to hear these wonderful poets. My name is Jennifer Franklin, and I am Program Director of the Hudson Valley Writers Center. We're thrilled to have you here tonight as we continue our 2023 reading series. Many of you were here at the season's launch when we celebrated the Stronger Than Fear anthology, edited by Carol Alexander and one of today's stellar readers, Stephen Massimilla. You will hear some more poems from that anthology today from some of the readers. But if this is your first time joining us for a reading, welcome. We hope you continue to come to our online readings as well as our readings in person and classes and our events. Please join us again this Wednesday, February 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern, as Spencer Reese, Ashley M. Jones, and Rick Mulkey read for Slappering Hall Press from their most recent poetry collections. And don't forget that on February 26th, Claudia Rankin will read with Emily Skillings on Zoom at 4 p.m. Sophia Bannister, the Assistant Program Director, will send you an email tomorrow letting you know about all of our upcoming readings and all of the links where you can buy the wonderful books from tonight's readers. I want to thank, as always, the board of the Hudson Valley Writers Center, everyone from Slappering Hall Press, as well as the foundations and grantors who support us, including Arts Westchester and NISCA. So people will continue coming in, but hopefully they'll be here before we hear from Sharon. Sharon Dolin is an award-winning American poet, translator, essayist, memoirist, and aphorist who teaches poetry workshops in New York City and Barcelona, Spain. She's the author of 7 poetry collections, most recently Manual for Living and Imperfect Present, just out in October 2022, both published by the University of Pittsburgh Press. She is the recipient of a 2021 NEA Fellowship in Translation. She lives in New York City, where she is associate editor of Barrow Street Press and directs Writing About Art in Barcelona. As Ellen Bass says, there are many ways to describe Imperfect Present, Sharon Dolin's new collection of poems. Delightful, earthy, erudite, engaging, but dazzling says it best. Though many poems take on our worst imperfections, hatred, violence, degradation of the planet, others make room for generosity and embrace our failings. The shattered pieces of some inconceivable whole. Imperfect Present is a powerful inquiry into what it means to be human, living in our present moment. She asks, quote, even in the midst of sorrow, how may we still summon joy? And Natasha Trethewey writes, Imperfect Present is a stunning book, not simply for its depth of feeling, piercing wit, and well-earned wisdom, but also for the brilliant play of language, the sheer sonic pleasures of it. I am reminded that Sharon Dolin is a poet for our time whose necessary voice I return to again and again. Please, everyone, help me welcome Sharon Dolin.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Thank you to the Hudson Valley Writers Center and to Sophia. And I also look forward to hearing Stephen and Miller and Elaine read. It's just a lovely afternoon that you've put together for us. So I'm really pleased to be here. I am going to read from Imperfect Present. I'm going to start with the title poem, the poem from which the title is taken. And all you need to know is that I have one of the etymologies of the name Moses inside of the poem. Make your home in the imperfect present. How many times have you thought, this is not it? When will my true life begin? How many times have you awakened to one more stage rehearsal for the main event that never seems to happen? If this is it, the tablets of your life broken, then reconstituted, so instead of God writing, a stuttering human whose name means drawn from water, incised the words you live by. If this imperfect, not as you had expected, is the show, if all your life could be lived in the improvised now, like the time you were awakened early in Bologna, brought before a class, unprepared as you were to read and speak, and because you had no time for anxiety to take your breath away, you stood and read and spoke into the moment. If all your mistakes are not retakes, filed away for the perfect cut, but the mosaic you are building from the shattered pieces of some inconceivable whole. The next poem I want to read is called If I Told You, and it's part serious, part, I think, tongue-in-cheek, playing around with my origins or potential origins. If I told you I am Roma, if I told you I am named after my great-grandmother Sabina, and that Sabina is a Romany name, if I told you there is no DNA marker for Roma, but I believe my people are Jewish Roma, if I told you I feel Roma in my blood when I watch flamenco, and I have a common Roma blood type, if I know how to speak every Romance language but Romanian, and my Romanian American grandmother, who knew no Yiddish, knew how to say cum va place, how do you like it, in Romanian. If I told you that proves nothing and everything. If I told you I am related to a Hollywood gangster on my Romanian side, and you probably believe Roma are gangster thieves. If I told you I am a thief and I am stealing my Roma identity. If I have never begged for a coin, never sat outside a subway or train station, though once stranded in Boston, asked strangers for a bed, ended up on a bench in the police station. If I told you I slept in a tent or under the canopy of stars, if the rhythms of my clapping are Roma and my people are from Iași in Moldavia, in eastern Romania, if I told you Roma played at Jewish weddings and Jews played at Roma weddings, yet during the Iași pogrom of June 1941, Romani were caught laughing as they helped the Nazis. If this is when I have my doubts about being Roma. If I told you the Romani part of me believes only in song and the Jewish part insists on writing it down. If I told you some Romani have light eyes and hair like mine. If I told you that part of me never feels at home and that part is a Romani Jew, that being an outcast once, why not be an outcast twice? This is called How Many Secrets? I don't know her name, the Chandigarh girl who was raped by her uncle. And I don't know that just because I too was once a 10-year-old girl in braids that I have any right to speak of her. But who will speak for her? She who had no right to her body, or to know that what bumped up inside her was not a kidney stone. If it is true, we all begin as female before testosterone washes through the womb to make some of us male. Isn't she close to being the mother of us all? At 6 months pregnant, denied an abortion by the Indian court, denied to her parents, that is, who have not told the girl she was pregnant, who now has had the baby cut from her as she lay in numbed sleep, the baby girl unseen by her or her parents. Why did she finally tell them about her uncle, her stomach pains a month earlier? What did she make of the heaviness of her breasts? Now I see her stitched up belly healing. How she'll have to go on when her whole life things have been done to her, for her. Now I can see her married off at 15, the stomach pains returning. When the anesthesia of not knowing wears off, let her mouth unstitch itself, even if it means knowing she has survived one cycle of suffering only to be born into another. Gee, these seem heavy. I don't know. Here's one more. I guess given the news in the last number of days, I was sort of drawn to reading some of these poems. This is called simply, How Do I Fix the World? How do I fix the world when I can't even fix myself? When a toothache obliterates the moment and Azazel takes all my sins from the goat? What is the secret heart of pain? What is the painful secret of the heart? Drilling through the numb is this ache that rises from my jaw to my temple to teach me to inhale the pain of those passing below in the street, in all the streets of my city, and exhale a healing balm that does not numb, but straightens out and calms all the tangled nerves of those inflamed. So I'm gonna skip the whole ekphrastic section that's in here, and I'm gonna move to another section of the book that's called Oblique Strategies. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt's cards. They were suggestions to jumpstart creativity. And I randomly drew the cards and I used their bits of advice as the titles of these poems. So this is called Trust in the You of Now, which is fleeting, which chameleons into the next you of until then, to when. Trust there will be a way forward when all paths are blocked with ice and wind. Directions are infinite slices of now. Study your compass. Your true north has shifted into spring. Believe you will show up as you have always done, no matter the weather undoes you. You built this well because it dips into the earth far past the point you could sound on your own. So use the bucket lowered by the rope, even the rain mixed with a few stray stars spangles the skin of the water you find. Remind yourself, as above, so below. Reflect that what you know and what you do not know will clasp hands to hoist you back up into the only moment there is. I see somebody nodding their head, so I guess it reached at least one of you. This one, again, thinking about the news, I've never read this one at a reading, so I thought I would try it. And again, that oblique strategy card simply used the word accretion. So that's the name of this poem, Accretion. And it's written in very short lines that kind of go down the page. This one on the, I don't know what side of the page it is for you. Okay, accretion, as in buildup, sedimentary layers of now. You cross the street, middle-aged white woman, invisible. If every day a Black man gets shot by police for holding a cell phone, a metal pipe, his own hand in his own pocket, his own counsel, how much empathy can you pull out? How much rage? As much as for Jews blown up in a French market or Pittsburgh synagogue? If what holds your grief most are your people, admit it. When you shake your head, admit you are haunted by Sandra Bland, Black woman stopped in her car, then dead in jail. Admit what? What holds you? Admit you pass for white and have benefited. Admit if you had a clearer head for statistics, percentages, would that save a life? If to save a life is to save the world, admit it. Each one is a lost world. How is my time doing? I was going to read maybe one more. I feel like I'm going quickly through these. Should I read two more? All right, I was gonna move on to what is like it's called From the Dream Notebooks. A lot of them are dreamy. Some of them are very Jewy, for what that's worth. I could read you two from here, and then I really would love to hear everyone else. So this is called A Dream is 1/60th Part of Prophecy. And that's a line from the Babylonian Talmud. Believe it or not, the Talmud, this Jewish book has it has a section that talks about dreams. And the first line of the poem is also a refutation of another line from the book, which is sleep is 1/60th of death. So again, a dream is 1/60th part of prophecy. My sleep is not 1/60th of death. It's the hold of a ship, the ship I never took, the flight left unflown, lover turned back at the door. It's not true I have unlived lives. They flock to me each night, pull back the covers as my eyes twitch beneath translucent shades, so I see and am part of the scene, of ravishing, the island gained, and always the secret room where there was no room. I pull aside the dresses and skirts, and the back wall of my closet opens into a field of time I step through, roll my body in the unlived hours like petals opening, and the opening petals roll me into the hours lived. Okay, I am going to close on maybe the final poem in the book. This idea of in the poem, of course, I put it as stones. There's a little bit of Samuel Beckett in this poem, but the idea of these two views of life, I'm nothing but dust and the world was made for me. This idea of, trying to hold both of these ideas in mind. It comes from a Hasidic master, and Martin Buber has wrote it down. So I didn't come up with that idea, but I use it in my way. So this is called Two Stones. And really thank you all for listening. Two stones. I keep despair in my pocket like a sucking stone I can pull out at any moment. Oh, in the morning it lies on my tongue when I can't get out of bed, reminding me I am nothing but dust, nothing but loose grains of sand, unable to compress myself into a form that rises and sings praises. Until I recall that other stone I keep in my other pocket, the one that intones, "For you the world was made." How can I retrieve this other stone, the stone of faith and self-belief, and moisten it on my tongue? Is it caught inside the shofar I am straining to blow? Spurt of pebble sound. How is it a stone, a clenched bundle of minerals, can loosen into particles of moan that stream out, awaken, arise, atone, return? Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was wonderful. And just a reminder for everyone to buy the books from these wonderful authors. Sophia is putting the link in the chat. Stephen Massimilla is a poet, scholar, professor, painter, and author, most recently of the poetry collection Frank Dark from Barrow Street Press, just out, and the anthology Stronger Than Fear, Poems of Empowerment, Compassion, and Social Justice, co-edited with Carol Alexander, who's here today in the audience. His multi-genre Cooking with the Muse from Tupelo Press in 2016, co-authored with Myra Kornfeld, who's also in the audience, won the Eric Hoffer Award and many other awards. Previous books and honors include The Plague Doctor in His Hole-Shaped Hat, 40 Floors from Yesterday, the Grolier Poetry Prize, a scholarly study of myth and poetry, and award-winning translations. He holds an MFA and a PhD from Columbia University and teaches at Columbia and the New School. In Frank Dark, philosophical and psychological investigation plumb many forms of tangible and visceral experience. This collection engages the environmental crisis, the pandemic, historical and current turmoil. He frankly confronts alienation, blindness, blight, injury, addiction, sickness, suicide, death, grief, and underworld ghosts. Of this deeply unsettled night come vision, compassion, love, and conscious reflections on the nature of perception, identity, reality, and writing itself. Here are just two excerpts from the copious praise of Stephen's new book. Emily Fragos writes, in Frank Dark, Stephen Massimilla offers us visions of light breaking through, though even as, quote, winter's darkness closes in behind our backs, end quote. We are compelled to follow Massimilla, a siren of language, an intoxicator, into his realm of beauty and sadness by a brilliance of thought and a radiance of emotion. These stunning poems, these daring visions dazzle. And Donald Ravel writes, in Frank Dark, we are granted sudden and sustained access to the intimate conversation of earth with history. Massimilla moves far beyond social discourse into a deeper communal understanding of language and its fate. That love may be a portion of that fate is a hope these poems cherish beyond words. Please, all of you, help me welcome Stephen Massimilla.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that extremely gracious introduction. And you also saved me the trouble of having to introduce that book, which I really appreciate. And I also want to thank Sophia on both of you for arranging this with me and us, and for all the work you put into this event. I also want to thank Barrow Street for publishing Frank Dark and Cave Moon, for publishing this other book, Stronger Than Fear. That's my artwork on the cover, co-edited with Carol Alexander. And I'd also like to thank the two other fantastic poets who are reading here today, in addition to Sharon's wonderful reading. We're going to hear from Miller Oberman and Elaine Sexton. And thank all of you who have shown up here today, friends, students, colleagues, all. It means so much. And I see exactly who you are. And I know that you're here, and some of you are on airplanes and in other difficult places. So I'm amazed that you're here. So where should I begin? I think I'll start because I'm thinking of what Jennifer said about death, grief, underworld, ghosts, blindness, blight, injury, addiction, sickness. All of that is in here. I'm showing you the cover because this is my artwork well, it's based on a very big painting that I did. It's a self-portrait, but Myra Kornfeld also put a lot of work into this cover, so it's a collaborative work. And this eye is a human eye, and over here you see a lizard eye, and the title Frank Dark. Blindness is one of the themes also of the collection, and an effort to see through by steering into the darkness. I'll start with a poem called Getaway. I guess you could just say get away, but it's one word, getaway. So don't leave, getaway. Outside lockdown New Orleans, pre-dawn high beams reach through long, dead, blonde grass. A metaphor is not a crime scene. A dreamer is not a detective, for one thing. Island lit from inside, hard to enter where the pelican swims out, beating wings, matted, emulsified, the half smile of a fish's wake, in fluid poison tears no seam of sky, no plane passes, no bird. It's a shame to lose this scenic route. Asterisk. Veins are greener than arteries. As on old maps, each line travels alone into the morning, down sandy trails, as shaky as a phantom's scarred forearms at dusk. When and where the light defines its pattern of flux, the only reliable fact in all that loss and mendacity. On this dock, a close skeletal moss of minutes kindling. The way forward is the way back and is not safe. So there's something odd about the circulatory system in that poem. The way forward is the way back. There are veins that resemble the lines on maps that lead us down paths, that resemble forearms that contain veins, similes within similes that bring us back to where we started. The next poem that I'm not going to read you, but I'm going to read you the title. It's called A Brief History of Human Knowledge. This poem attempts to sum up, in this poem I attempt to sum up all of human knowledge in about 2/3 of a page, but it's very dense, and you won't have time to process it. So I'm going to move on to the next poem entitled Map of Scars. And I know you know this, but a speaker is, very often the speaker resembles the poet, but the poet might project that voice onto a character. And so, as Emily Dickinson said, when I say I mean not myself, but a supposed person. Map of Scars. And this poem is set in Los Angeles, where I've spent a lot of time during the pandemic. Map of scars. I'm going to repeat that because that's also the first line. Map of scars, and Los Angeles feels huge to my uncharted goal. Wavering district gunned with lights, delirious veined streets opening treacherously between gas clouds, listing against the ocean, so many black stars as the heat sinks and glisters into listlessness. Where is the nearest hospital sign? When will I learn to read? The airbrush deity on the universal billboard, lounging up there, a cream pink lemur of wasted paper stuck together, eyeing sleepless escalators, noiseless crushes, cars. It goes on, and I, the scavenger's double, having fiddled with oblivion, quitting this shore, lifting over the ships, the persistent hiss of waves, haven't gone under, not yet. I've never seen the watchtower, do not know the junkie's name, tapped out elsewhere on a cell phone ditched on the beach. Tell me, fellow, dirt gray feather shedder, filthy artist, poisoned loiterer among breaths without bodies. Are we tired of not shining on heaven's silver X-ray screen? Does your brain whirl with this distance? The old damage between us, wherever you are, whatever you are. The next poem I'd like to read also appears in this other book I mentioned, this anthology, Stronger Than Fear, Poems of Empowerment, Compassion, and Social Justice. And but it also appears in Frank Dark. And I need to explain a couple of things about it, or I'm afraid it won't completely make sense. And I'm going to have to also summarize a little bit, leave out parts of the poem when I read it to you. It's what Robert Lowell, we say Robert Lowell, but we should really say Robert Lowell, calls an adaptation or an imitation, which means that it's based on a poem that was written earlier, but it doesn't merely translate it. It also, I altered it quite a bit when I created this poem. So it's a very creative adaptation, and it's based on a work that the great Eugenio Montale wrote in fascist Italy when Mussolini reigned, and the original poem is called La Primavera Hitleriana, and it anticipates or it hopes for, or the poet is hoping in the poem, the speaker is for the imminent liberation of Italy from fascism. And there's a whole biblical subtext that I don't have time to explain, but I should let you know the poem is addressed to someone named Clytia or Clytie, who is the sunflower woman in Greek mythology and also Montale's Beatrice. And she in turn is modeled on Irma Brandeis, a glamorous Jewish American Dante scholar who escaped persecution and death and has left at the time that this poem is being written, and he's recalling her. A word about my background: I'm both Italian and Jewish, so there are a lot of Massimillas still in southern Italy, but in another branch of my family, my grandmother got here early enough, but all of her relatives were wiped out in the Holocaust. And this poem was written at the height of the Trump administration. The Hitlerian spring. Sorry, one more little gloss. It starts in spring, and there are all these mayflies that come out, and it was a particularly big mayfly year. And even though it was a cold spring, so they all come out, have their one day of have fun for that one day, and then they all die. But the sky is so full of these white specks that spring feels like winter. So I will now read the actual poem. The Hitlerian spring. A thick fog of maddened mayflies swirls around dirty lamps and over the parapets. Underfoot, they form a shroud of crackling sugar. Spring slowly frees the nocturnal frost from caverns, ghosted gardens extending from Mayano to these shores. Up the street, an infernal messenger just flew by, flanked by curdling cries of Heil, H-E-I-L, concealed as the Wagnerian orchestra pit at one of his mad midnight rallies, a mystical gulf lit up and flagged with mangled crosses just embraced him, gulped him down. And then there's a description of how it's Sunday and all the shops are closed, and there's a butcher. He is a friendly butcher who would garland the muzzles of slaughtered goats with grapes. Easter rite for those still unaware that the blood has utterly changed. Shattered wings and larvae on the banks, the water goes on chewing at the shoreline. Everything we had was all for nothing then. And then there's a description of the San Giovanni festival, which is not very festive if you think of the socio-historical moment. And the speaker is saying goodbye to Clizia, doesn't know when or if he'll ever see her again. And then these lines follow. And the heliotrope unfolding from your palms, all scorched, sucked dry by this pollen that hisses fire and bites with the teeth of a blizzard. No one is nameless anymore. Excuse me, no one is blameless anymore. This ulcerated spring is festive, even if it freezes all this death in death. Look again, up there, Clizia, lies your destiny. You who keep love unaltered in its alteration until the blind sun you carry inside you can bedazzle the other and explode in him for all, or for you at least. And then there's a description of a Sabbath that should be a celebratory occasion, but it's being led by Mussolini and his henchmen. So it's essentially a warlock Sabbath. And so I gave you a feel for that poem, but we've got a strict time limit here, so I'm going to leave it at that. The next poem I'm going to read you is from a part in the anthology where a relationship is explored between the speaker and a beloved. And I'm going to go right to the depths of that, which is a quiet meditation poem, relationship poem called Almost Past That. This is a much quieter poem than the one I just read. Almost Past That. By dusk, the lake was almost not there, the bed looking as it hadn't. I sensed a question in your eyes, of a luster often seen on teapots, rarely on people. Or maybe you had nothing left to ask. You were not you at all, I guessed, as leaf shades migrated through leaves and hung in the treetops. Last night, I was never a child so sick and alone that I could barely breathe. 2. This morning, leaves shake at the dim lit glass, faint paisley of lake light on the backside of everything. Suddenly, last night feels like illusion, outlived by a wish. Innocent until I called it back, looking back for the hint of a kettle's breath. To where I like to think, I thought I like to know the faintest things. I know enough to know most things worth knowing are past that, you and I, and should withdraw from all we half know, but reach instead toward you, limp in sleep, and touch your head. So there's something almost Jamesian in the diction of I like to think, I thought, that I like to know. I like to think that I thought that I like to know. So we're dealing with tiny little nuances there. And then in the next poem, which I don't have time to read you, I'll just read you the first line because it continues this the kind of sequence about this relationship. Then I burst out crying. I dreamed it was not a knife that had come between us. So that's just a hint of a different mood or mode. And this is followed by another poem called Lowell Harbor, though I just told you it should really be Lowell Harbor. And as you know, Robert Lowell is often regarded as the founder of the confessional school of poets, who were the first to introduce certain very personal and forbidden themes into their work. This poem is about suicide. A brilliant and close poet friend of mine committed suicide, and I've been writing about suicide ever since. And those of you who know me well know who that is. So it's Sarah, but the poem is not just about that, just about Sarah. Lowell Harbor. I saw you through an oval window floating, your dress a moth bobbing in a water glass. The door was always open, and how difficult for you not to remember that when you were looking for the blue pills on the nightstand. 2. You were barely a light shaft, shifting over the beach to the floor of the sea, your feet quieted by moss, weaving through sea ferns, every tiny life defining its limits. 3. I saw you headed out on the sand road, quiet as light, feline and unreasoning, in leaf shade, lovely, no longer worried by the salt wind. 4. As the harbor opened, on the phosphic dial of the alarm clock about to sound the old arc of teeth, the crossing never seemed difficult, but when you moved to bid the light farewell, the sight of a pair of cats licking their back paws caught you. I'm assuming I'm almost out of time, so I'll read maybe a fraction of a poem and then one tiny poem after that. And the fraction comes again from another poem that is also in Stronger Than Fear. So there's this little bit of overlap. And this poem is called After the Ritual of Descent. And just a word about Stronger Than Fear, because the other two poets reading today also have work in this anthology. And it's the themes are compassion, empowerment, social justice, social education. And the book deals with marginalization and oppression and dehumanization and xenophobia in many forms. But the poems themselves are also about the struggle to gain rights and acceptance and to inhabit the self fully and freely, despite any obstacles or opposition one may face or that one does face. And yet the poems often don't seem to be explicitly or directly socio-political. Very often they're oblique or even mythological, as this poem is. And there's a theme in this poem of descent to the underworld and back. That's why it's called After the Ritual of Descent, which is a reference to the work of Eliade, the great Romanian scholar of myth. And I'm just going to take you not to the descent or to the return, but right to the bottom of the underworld in this poem, and just read you a few lines. My animal blood in the great below, I was huddled between our cross and our menorah, branches trampled 1,000 times over, heavier raps on the shut door to the dark, and the blow of the thunderbolt that swallowed the 5-mile-high night, when the barking returned and the brutal hussars entered private quarters of dread, pulling the threads of a tear from the horrified eyelid. And now just read one tiny final poem. I also have a poem, by the way, about a very poem about kind of descent to the underworld that's very a pandemic dreamscape. and the speaker has succumbed to COVID. And in the middle of the poem, the speaker says, "Why would I bother crying that the universe is inhuman?" The title of that poem is "No Night to Drown In." But lest you think that everything I have to read today is really dark and, like the title suggests, there's a lot of light breaking through. And I'd like to end with a tiny poem, a tiny meditation in the spirit of the Buddha and the Bhagavad Gita on the liberating realm within and beyond the narrow confines of the self. It's called, and the poem is much shorter than what I just said. It's called Attempt at Bare Geography. Attempt at bare geography. Our first sound is a cry. Then it takes too long to realize we must be quiet, to begin to hear the quiet in our lives before the quiet beyond our lives begins. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you to our audience, everyone who's here today listening to the poets. Please remember that if you have questions for the poets about anything they've read or anything else, you can type that into the chat, and Sophia and I will be asking the poets questions after the last two readers. Miller Oberman is a former Ruth Lilly Fellow, as well as a 2016 winner of the 92nd Streetwise Boston Review Discovery Prize. His translation of selections from the Old English rune poem won Poetry's John Frederick Nims Memorial Prize for Translation in 2013. Miller's first book, The Unstill Ones, a collection of poems and Old English translations, was published in September of 2017 by Princeton University Press. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife and holds a PhD in English from the University of Connecticut. An exciting debut collection of original poems and translations from Old English, The Unstill Ones takes readers into a timeless, shadow-filled world where new poems sound ancient and ancient poems sound new. Award-winning scholar-poet Miller Oberman's startlingly fresh translations of well-known and less familiar Old English poems often move between archaic and contemporary diction, while his original poems frequently draw on a compressed, tactile Old English lexicon and the powerful formal qualities of medieval verse. Publishers Weekly says, Oberman beautifully renders a complex and ever-changing knot of temporalities in which past and present overlap and exert force on each other. Thomas Lux wrote, "Rarely does one read something both so old and at the same time so new. The poems are immediately understandable, mysterious, and authentic. Miller Oberman has written a book that makes me want to shake his hand, to salute him, and say frankly that these poems and this book fill me with gratitude and joy. High praise indeed. Please, all of you, help me welcome Miller Oberman."
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be here, and thank you all for being here. Sharon and Stephen, it was so lovely to hear you read, and Elaine, I can't wait to hear you read. Wow, that really just made me miss Tom Lux, which maybe some of you do too. And I'm going to start with a poem that I really like to start with. It's called Caedmon's Hymn. It's my translation of Caedmon's Hymn, which is the first poem in the English language, supposedly. I'm about to tell you a bunch of lies. Here are the lies about the poem. Caedmon was an illiterate herdsman, and he was drinking with his buddies, and they all went around and they were saying poems, but he couldn't read or say a poem. So he just got really drunk and fell asleep in the barn with the goats. And while he was sleeping, God gave him this dream, which was a poem. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to translate it is because of a phrase in the poem The phrase is "Hey Addis Sheop," which is, the poem is really a list of names for God. But usually when people translate it, one of the issues that I have with translations of Old English poetry is people don't often translate it literally in places where I think it should be. And the literal translation of Hey Addis Sheop is the first poet. And I loved the idea of God as a poet for obvious reasons. And I didn't know why no one had just translated it that way. So this is Cadman's hymn. Now we will honor the heaven kingdom's keeper, the measurer's might and his mind thoughts, the work of the wonder Father as he wrought, boundless Lord, the beginning of every beauty. The first poet made for the souls of soil, heaven for a roof, holy maker. After that, mankind's keeper made middle earth, master almighty, eternal Lord, earth for everyone. I'm going to read a few poems from my book, and then I'm going to read a few poems from my new manuscript, which I hope is almost done. This is called Lies After the War. We went to Bull Run, or was it Manassas? One of those, past Battlefield Ford, past Glory Days bar in the strip mall. Or was it before the mall was built? Or was it after the mall was abandoned? I was grizzled with age. I was 21 at the small beige visitor center. I remember it without sound. They had a machine there that sucked up sound. It was mostly made of hollows, blanks, lac, and also plastic. It came with a smaller version of itself, whose job was to suck the sound of the larger sound sucker. It did its work. It was about the size of a foot. Either run that, or the place would be filled with ordinary sounds, squirrels twitching their tails, chattering one to another in their ceaseless brag about acorn hordes. They couldn't risk the sound of dirt suffocated under the sown sod, or the possibility of rustling leaves. This is not the grass where it happened, not the starved pines. These clouds have shifted. Never do they look like hacked arms, heaped corpses. We lay in the sound, empty field under the cloud constellation of Virginia. Look up. That one's a crutch. That one's a stump. That one's a burning town and the yellow tendrils of gangrene. The air turned to ether. The ether was painless. It was all painless, I swear. I'm gonna read a couple of riddles translated from Old English. And I really like translating some of these riddles that were really fragmentary because they were in the Exeter book, which someone set a hot poker down on accidentally, even though there was only the one copy. And so like there's a lot of poems in there that have these holes in them. And the riddles especially, I think, benefit from those holes. Some of them are just very beautiful. So this is riddle 94, and I'm just gonna pause for the burned sections. Smoother, higher than heaven, gladder than the sun, steel, sharper than salty, more beloved than all this light, lighter now. I have no idea what that is. This is riddle 78. Often I floods, a kind of minnows, and me too, as I to him, not at home sat, the deep sea killed through skill work, bent on the brim of the sea. I'm going to read this poem called Theory, which I actually wrote the first draft of, or of another poem that didn't go anywhere, in the first workshop that I ever took as an undergraduate, which was with Tom Lux. And so it's useful for me to remember that you can maybe work on something for 20 or more years, and eventually maybe it will come out. And this begins with an epigraph from Judith Butler's book, Gender Trouble, which I highly recommend. Gender is thus a construction that regularly conceals its genesis, the tacit collective agreement to perform, produce, and sustain discrete and polar genders as cultural fictions is obscured by the credibility of those productions and the punishments that attend not agreeing to believe in them. Yes, they chased me. Yes, it was spring. It was spring. It was spring. It was spring all day and night. All the trees leaning into light, their fuzzy buds and calyxes, the grass greener than whatever's greenest, the daffodils yellow and cream. This telling will be different, I swear, from when I was 18 and described the perfect springiness of the grass under my high tops. Fuck the lyric mountains and the air. I had just turned 10. We were playing Capture the Flag when the boys in my class and their older brothers turned. In the mock Olympic games, I'd won javelin, shot put, and wrestling, came second in long jump. But that didn't matter now. They chased me. I fled, past the echoing concrete of the pavilion, past barrel trash cans fizzing with flies, past the short field over the edge of Ragged Mountain. That's the real name of it. I say the real names of things when I know them. Maybe somebody said a name then, maybe to Ethan, lithe as a deer, Ethan, my friend, who'd given me a folding knife for my birthday, smiling quietly, or otherwise their blood moved them like magnets, like swallows or certain bugs that hang together like nets, fly like they're woven together. Maybe somebody said Dyke or Goy, their names for me. A boy who had just started shaving gave a whistle, gestured with his arm. My body pressed against the mountain's steepness. They are so high above me, I can see the soles of their shoes when they lift them up to kick dirt and leaves in my face. Zigzag, swoosh, honeycomb, head of a fanged, roaring wildcat. They stone me. Stone, 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 stone. When I wrote of this before, I focused on the rocks, gave their scientific names, suggested I was becoming one. Naming things feels good. Cataloging has great colonial power and so distracting, a way of looking away. They threw and threw all the roly-polies from under the rocks, revealed and scurrying. No one came. No one stopped them. They stopped maybe because they got bored. At first, they got farther away as they threw. Someone heel dragged a line in the grass and they stood behind it. Humans in a field, men in the man-made ground, keeping at bay below the tree line's dark, dangling edge, something else, something not made like them, or unmade, abject and profane. I heard a sound from my body, like a growl. Heat poured off my head. I felt my personness evaporating as the boys laughed, upright in the mown fields. I bellied up with millipedes, snails, last year's leaves, rotting and skeletal. The body lost human speech then, but somewhere, someone was writing. I know that now, at a desk in a cool room, shining-haired. You can't see them now, you in the bloody, torn jeans covered with mountain stuff, but you will. They are explaining it, that these boys, Ethan, Noah, Sean, big blonde Jeff, who once picked you up and stuffed your whole body in a trash barrel in a week's worth of discarded lunches, maggots, broken glass, and who claimed to have seen a movie called Carnal Knowledge, but wouldn't describe it. They're explaining it all in a book. They're saying, you are a person who came first, not a copy. They are saying these boys are fictions, stoning other fictions. These are the punishments that attend. These are ghosts throwing at nothing. This poem is called Joy, and it's about a real dream that I had, which I was made fun of for when I woke up and recounted it. Joy. Like the time I dreamt about a loon family. Just some common loons, not metaphors in any way. Just real loons in a lake swimming near each other, so it was clear they were a set, preferring each other's company in the cold, still lake with its depth of reflected pines. The curve of their black heads and sleek necks, black and white stripes, then checks on their folded wings. Floating so low atop their reflections, they almost seem inside them. Their wails like wolves, their calls like an echo without origin, their calls like an echo of lake or what makes lake lake. How nice to think that the male and female loons cannot be told apart by their plumage, and that they build a nest and sit on eggs together. One of their calls is called tremolo. This is called Comes With. I guess I'm avoiding all of them today, but the new book that I'm working on is a lot about my father. And there's a single poem in here that is about my mother, and I'm going to read it now. It's called Comes With. Like many people, I have a mother. She has always been and remains a big gasper. The gasps are loud and not a little scary. They sound extreme, like if you found out something so shocking or one last breath before your ship went down. The other day in torrential rain, I very slowly backed her car into a fire hydrant someone had, against all good sense, painted white. It was surprising. She gasped, like if you learned of a coup in your country, or if waiting for the subway, someone shoved you close to the platform's edge where you stood holding your baby. Sometimes I feel anxious. My brother says it's not the truly frightening things that cause the gasps. Where do they come from, I ask? Is it hereditary? But neither of us recall our grandparents doing it. Maybe, I suggest, she gasps for the whole family, all its known and unknown shock, for all assimilated German Jews who trained themselves to golf at country clubs, decorate trees indoors at Christmas, and never under any circumstances to gasp. Maybe she does it historically for them all. My brother finds this generous. It's about control, he says, or lack thereof, and a transference of the helplessness to affect the truly terrible things onto the mundane. And that ended the matter, though not, of course, the sound. And who would I be without it? Calmer, less jumpy, or nothing at all, as if that gasp were the lines in a poem that never seem right, but without them, the poem loses its meaning. Now, or even earlier, is where I'd usually describe the sound. I view lyric description as an important part of the poet's job. I tried rocks against a rasp, or frozen wind on a file sucked through a chipper shredder, or inhaling broken glass. Perhaps I'm too close to the sound, like how growing up, current jelly chicken comes with string beans almondine. Everything had something that comes with, and only now I realize it wasn't limited to dinner. The gasp and life are linked. Sound lives in the body, currents through cells, gales in the throat. Do I have time to read one more? Okay, I'm gonna read one more. This poem is called Giant Bird. I have a friend who used to say she wished a giant bird would come down, rarely and irregularly, to take someone away. She is a person I consider truly kind, puts glasses over house spiders to gently nudge them onto paper and take them outside. She thought fear of the giant bird might help us, that knowing it might come take us or our neighbors or loved ones would make us kinder, more joyful. But wouldn't cancer do that, I say? Or someone hit by a bus, a brain aneurysm? No, she said, with the bird, it would be different. And sometimes I saw her looking up at clouds or out over deep, deep water, eyeing horizons, perhaps thinking of it, the giant bird that will come, flapping and shrieking to remove one of us villagers. I don't think of it much anymore, except every now and then if I am dog tired of my own suffering. Like last week, when shirtless on the exam table, getting an EKG to find out if I was having a heart or panic attack, the nurse, seeing my chest scars, asked in shock if I used to be a girl, and then asked if my parents were okay with me, and told me about the one other trans person she'd ever met, a woman who even was pretty and even had a normal boyfriend who was even good looking. I thought it might be a great time for the giant bird to come take someone away. Thank you so much for being here and listening.
Thank you so much, Miller. That was wonderful. I think we should all give that mother poem to our mothers. When is your new book coming out? Do you know?
I have to find someone who's willing to publish it.
Okay, so everyone order Miller's book from 2017. Sophia's putting it in the chat. Elaine Sexton's latest collection of poems is Drive from Grid Books in 2022. Her previous books of poetry are Sleuth from New Issues, Causeway, and Prospect Refuge from Sheep Meadow Press. Her poems, art reviews, book reviews, and works in visual art have appeared in journals, anthologies, textbooks, and websites, including APR, Art in America, Poetry, the Oprah Magazine, and Poetry Daily, among others. Her recent iPhone pics have been included in the Carriage Trade Gallery's annual social photography exhibition in New York City. An avid bookmaker and micro publisher, she is the author of several chapbooks and has curated site-specific events with limited edition chapbooks and periodicals. She teaches text and image and poetry at Sarah Lawrence and has been guest faculty at NYU and in the graduate writing program at CUNY. Formerly a senior editor at Art News and visual arts editor for Tupelo Quarterly, she serves as a contributing editor for On the Seawall and is a member of the National Book Critics Circle. Silently pulling for itself, the will wants the body to give it what it wants, Sexton writes in Between the Car and the Sea, at once a description of a car's body propelling her onward, and of the poet herself, the one behind the wheel of this masterful collection. In an extraordinary act of volition, the author does not stop at the trope of ambition, but powers instead toward the urgent concerns of the will and intention. In Drive, Sexton explores our most fragile points of connection to lovers and family, to the living and the dead, and to oneself, one's own life's work, with care and wisdom of the one who knows these roads. In her hands, these delicate boundaries become navigable. They are both her route and her destination. And G. Thiel says of this collection, in this dazzling collection, Elaine Sexton brings a life lived in poetry to a startling new premise. Acceleration equals exhilaration. These poems make me long to be on the road in America, foot on the pedal and heart in the wind. Please help me welcome Elaine Sexton.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's just thrilling to see so many friends and strangers, and just wonderful. It's a wonderful audience. So thank you, Jennifer. It's wonderful to read at the Hudson Valley Writers Center. I've had the privilege of reading for each of my previous 3 books, so this is really a homecoming to read for this book here. And Stephen and Sharon and Miller, wow. I mean, I think this is just an example of, and my poems are very different from each of you, so it's just wonderful to see the breadth of poetry. And I think everyone's going to steal the guests for the whole family from you, Miller. That's don't we all, if we're lucky enough to have a family. Okay, so also I want to just I'm going to read mostly from my new book, Drive, and I just also want to call out my editor and publisher is here tonight for Grid Books, and she is a dream publisher. So thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to read mostly from this book, but in honor of the fact that each of my books have been celebrated at this center, I'm going to read one from each of the 3 previous books. And I kind of noticed I've also had the privilege of a number of reviews of this book, and recently did an interview. And I learned a little bit about my own work, which is that there's kind of this thread. I mean, I knew that there was a thread of transportation throughout the poems, but it just sort of came home more vividly, most recently. Anyway, so the title of the book is Drive, and it's meant to suggest a literal and a metaphoric transportation, what it is to have drive and to be driven, and a kind of volition in time and space. So quite a few of the poems take place in a car, but it also is, as evidenced by the cover art, which is a painting by Catherine Bradford, it's the body as a kind of vehicle as well. So I'm going to start with the epigraph to the book, which is a tiny prose poem that uses the repetition of the most beautiful thing, identifying the most beautiful thing about one thing is another. The most beautiful thing about my car is the beach. And the most beautiful thing about the beach is watercolor. And the most beautiful thing about watercolor is the word. And the most beautiful thing about the word is pigment. And the most beautiful thing about pigment is the soil. And the most beautiful thing about the soil is the earth. And the most beautiful thing about the earth is the sea. And the most beautiful thing about the sea is the drive. I'm going to begin with the first poem in the book, which the title of which is This, and it's dedicated to a periodic writing partner of mine, the poet Heather Sellers, and there's a direct address in the beginning. This. In the way your poem with a lake in it is not about the lake, mine with a dog and the broken heart is not about a dog or saving face. Your ibis as pearls in their nests is no more about the sway of banyan trees than it is about lovers and brothers or fathers living among the cedars and scat in my poems, nor those pyres by the tracks waiting for a match. All queerly remembered, queer as teaching ourselves not to drive, not to drown, or of the clouds that don't move. What a seahawk carries in her talons in the long dirt road and the navel of the moon. All poems about storms at sea combined are not about the earth's proclivities, but deciding what spins. Everything is about gravity, the grave pulling for us. Each day it starts with a bark calling our name. This tiny poem, the title is The Motorist, and it starts with an epigraph from Susan Sontag. Life is a movie, death is a photograph. A picture of a car and its driver competes poorly with the road, the cliff, the sea, moving in real time. Between the driver and her heap, her free arm open, her hand is catching and letting go atoms and atoms of that which shall remain nameless, so long as she knows she is free not to be where she is expected to go. Not all the poems take place in a car, but I've kind of coupled together the ones for tonight that do. The title of this poem is Driving, and if you were reading it on the page, you would see the italics section, but I'll just point out that towards the end of the poem, alone and in a circumstance is a quote from Emily Dickinson, as is another part, but it's attributed in the poem. Driving. There are still dead zones in America where no one lives and satellites turn a deaf ear. It was only because of the light leaving the sky, ice forming on the glass of my stalled car, I entered the sedan of a stranger, a man who stopped on the interstate in one of those red states shaped like a box. There are still strangers who stop for a woman in distress and think only of her distress. If anyone strikes me on the street, I can return the blow, the reclusive poet wrote, alone and in a circumstance. But what did she know? I just want to pause here for a moment to acknowledge, as Sharon had, the recent horrific death of Tyree Nichols, and just the risk it takes to be in a car. And in this particular, in many of my poems celebrate being in a car and the luxury of driving, but this recent death brings home the risk of just what it is to be Black while driving in America. And I just want to acknowledge that in this context. So I'm going to read from my first book, Sleuth, a poem called Public Transportation. And this was one of the first poems I published, and it came out in Prairie Schooner. So thank you, Hilda Roz, who was the editor at the time. Public Transportation. She is perfectly ordinary, a cashmere scarf snugly wrapped around her neck. She is a middle age that is crisp, appealing in New York, a brain surgeon or designer of blow dryers. I know this because I am in her skin this morning, riding the bus, happy to be not young, happy to be thrilled that it is cold and I have a warm hat on. Everyone is someone other than you think under her skin. The driver does not have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in his metal lunchbox. He has caviar left over from New Year's and a love note from his mistress, whom he just left on the corner of 6th Avenue and 14th Street. When she steps off the bus to take over the wheel of the crosstown number 8, she knows she is anything but ordinary. She climbs under the safety bar and straps the belt on over her seat. She lets the old lady who is rich but looks poor take her time getting on. She lets the mugger who looks like a parish priest help her. She waits as we sit, quiet in our private, gorgeous lives. So some of these poems, when I go back, you realize that what public transportation, was on hold for the last couple of years. So just even getting in a bus is a liberating thing right now. I'm going to read a poem called Onion Field from Causeway. This is my second book, Causeway. Onion Field. Our friends wanted us to taste everything, their dust and sweet air, their mangy Mexican dogs, banana leaves floating, botanical, architectural. Here they trade mostly roses, fields and fields of their bodies for sale in red bundles like firewood on the road. Here, where the barb in the barbed wire fence caught me, onions roasted on a grill with clusters of chilies I never dared touch with my tongue. Only a small thread of me kept snagging and unraveling as crops turned and miles of fence framed beauty like something lit by a match. Did I know even then our friend and driver, our host, would die months later, and you, whom I love, I would leave. And the house where we stayed year after year down a lane cut through onion fields would be sold, that I'd actually risk not coming back to this place again and again. So, okay, at last in my in my walking down memory lane, I'm going to read a poem called called Artwork, after a poem by Kabir. Artwork. How do you, asks the guard, protect a landscape where there are no trees or soil, where satellites stationed like stars watch stones and the sea reproduce freely, where rain is transparent but solid, where sounds replace color, and nothing agrees to stay on the walls, where objects go after ideas? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? The thing I stole from Kabir is that last line. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay, is everybody still with us? The risk of going last is you're patiently listening to all of us. I'm going to read a poem that Stephen and his co-editor Carol Alexander published in Stronger Than Fear. I'll give another plug to Stronger Than Fear, which is, some anthologies, we've read and it's like hit or miss, but I have to say it's just really a lot of great hits in this anthology. So thank you for including me. And so this poem is Landscape with Power Lines. And oops. Sorry. Bear with me, I wrote the wrong page number down. So this brief story about this poem is I moved into a new house out here on the east end of Long Island, across the street from a tree farm, and it's beautiful. But the very first morning we moved in, woke up, and all I could see were these thick power lines strung through the trees in front of our house. And I immediately had to do a correction about my feelings about that. This also took place during a time during the last election, and Stephen recognized it as with the undertone of politics in the poem, or social justice, let's say. Landscape with Power Lines. The twisting chords no longer bother me. As I see it, they heighten the light, halved and halved again, leaves and clouds, snow and storm. The breeze moves an olive branch over one line, then another below. Each branch acts as if her leaves aren't about to be swayed to stay on one side for good. They remain undecided. Today, they are subject to a dust kicked up as a truck hauling crops powers past. Birds make their wild plans to nest one last time. They weave their sticks and tissue their housing, including these lines. We are bound to live together. So I'm going to read two more poems. So this This is another poem. So the poem that I read as an epigraph, the most beautiful thing about one thing is another. I was on a jag with that while I was working on this book, and I had like, dozens of them, and only like 3 of them survived. So this one and the very next one are are all that survived from a lot of attempts at this. So this poem is also untitled. The most beautiful thing about a convertible is hair. And the most beautiful thing about hair is its disposition, dead, but alive in the skin, in the air. The skin holding on to each strand for dear life, alive in the wind. The most beautiful thing about the wind passing over the skin is sensation, cellular, invisible, metabolic. What is metabolic is life-sustaining. And the most life-sustaining thing I can think of today is decency. And decency is blind, unseen, until it isn't. Okay, so I'm going to end with the last tiny poem. And again, thank you everyone for coming. I'm so grateful. I see so many people who've come to other readings. I try to mix it up so you're not hearing the same poems over and over. So anyway, thank you. And I look forward to the Q&A. Tiny poem. This was in response to seeing the scraps of papyri with Sappho's text at the Morgan Library in New York. The scraps of text on papyrus, dry as dirt, attributed to Sappho, are pinned in place by the tiniest strips of archival tape. I had never seen adhesive so delicate, so trusted. The most beautiful thing about trust is what holds it in place. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Elaine. And thank you to all the readers for these wonderful readings. And again, I want to remind you all to purchase their books. The links are here in the chat today. You could copy and paste. And for your convenience, Sophia will also be sending you a thank you note tomorrow with the links. So thank you, Sophia, for doing that. And thank you to the wonderful audience. And they're writing questions in the chat, but Sophia and I will each start with a question for all of you. The first question we typically like to ask all of our readers, and keep in mind that many of our students at the Hudson Valley Writers Center are working on their first collections, their chapbooks or full-length poetry collections, and many of them are coming back to writing after having careers and after raising families and doing other things. So they're older students and they're putting together their first books. So what advice would each of you briefly give to those students while they're doing their manuscript revisions?
Let's see. I'm trying to think about what area of that in the revision process, right? I would say get trusted readers to get good feedback from colleagues, and actually maybe people you don't know, which is probably the hardest thing to do, right? To get someone to read your work that's not going to, know you too well to give you objective feedback, but.
And I would also just say, start with your strongest poems.
Oh, yeah.
Don't think you should save them for last, especially if you're trying to get the book published. So yeah, start, obviously the whole book should be strong, but start with the work that is really strong. Put it right up front. It's a really hard thing to say because, so much of putting together a book is really intuition. So how do we, how do you advise somebody about their own intuition about their book? What poems you have to move things around. And if you're not writing in a series or a sequence, as I sometimes am, you have to see what poems, how they're speaking to each other, and see what kind of an order makes sense for you. Yeah,
I mean, I think of the manuscript as a poem, like the book is a poem, like the way you compose a poem, the order. Although we put all this effort into the order of things, and almost nobody reads a book of
That's
poetry
true.
from front to back. But
that's true. But don't you usually read the first few poems
Yeah.
and then you start to flip around?
To piggyback on what both Elaine and Sharon said, it's funny because I think this advice is really practical. At the last reading, we got more to that same question, Jennifer. We got more advice about how to write really good poetry. For instance, Ellen Bass said, "Don't buff out every oddity," and I just love. I love the way she said it as well as what she said. And Jane Hirschfeld started talking about the weather, and you have to be open to all the vicissitudes of the weather. And I thought I was being mundane and practical, Elaine, when I said, you can print them all out and start shuffling them on the floor for a long time. But at some point, you're going to want to get someone who's not you to look at it because you know your work too well and you need that objectivity. If someone helps you with the process, at first you might feel like, oh, no, I have to go throw up. This is not going to work. But then you'll look at it again and you'll say, hey, this isn't half bad. So it really helps to get out of your own head because you're too close to your work when you try to put it all together. Every one of them is your baby. And to piggyback on what Sharon said, I agree about putting strong work up front, also at the very end. But the hardest one is, it's not that important, but I would not worry about the first poem until you're finally at the last stage of the process, because everything withers under the stage lights when you try to put it first. So what are you going to put first? Maybe don't spend all day thinking about that because you'll probably change your mind later. So those are a few pointers.
Yeah, and I would also, I would second what you were quoting Ellen Bass as saying. Yeah, keep in your weird and wiggy. Yeah, don't, you can over revise and smooth out all the rough edges and the poem can just die underneath. You don't want to shine it and burnish it so much that you lose the energy of the original impulse to write it. So it's, and the same thing is true with visual artists. You have to know when to stop painting, right? So you have to know when to stop revising. Yeah.
I would add to that I find it very important to be in the right mood when you're doing this, and specifically a non-self-hating mood, which is maybe only 20% of my moods, but I think going to do something like that when you're not a little bit in love with your work is also a problem. And I think, we hear a lot about cutting your darlings and being a harsh critic and trying to be objective about your work. But I often think that can lead to the sort of over polishing where what made something really special can get left out.
I agree.
Those were such useful answers. Thank you. We got a question in the chat from an audience member for Stephen about the relationship between his practice as a painter and poetry writing. So I want to extend that question to all four of you and ask, is there some kind of practice in your life that you feel is related in some way or nourishes in some way your practice as a poet?
We'll start with you, Stephen.
I think because the question's directed at me, I'll jump in. And I really was a painter before I was a poet. My grandparents met at the Art Students League on 59th Street. And I don't know if that's why, but I have this long family history. And my sixth grade teacher said to my mom, "You really should put this kid in art school." But I refused at that time to hand in my poetry anthology. I really didn't want to do that. I only became really interested in poetry when I was asked to write it myself, and then I could make the link. So when Mr. Kilgallen in seventh grade started assigning poetry writing, then I thought, okay, well, I'm now making it myself, and now I care about it, because why would I want to collect it if I don't really, really understand it? You have to start with falling in love with poetry. And now my process is so odd because I can only really do the deepest writing late at night when nobody's going to breathe or even think in my vicinity. So it's this, but I always start with pen and paper. That's coming out of my sketching process. And then I move, and I wish I could show you my sketchbook right now. I don't have it, but there are a lot of drawings in it. And, because there I don't need to be all alone to do that. And then I can very careful about moving to that dangerous friend, the computer. Derek Walcott, in a workshop many years ago, said that, pointed out that Hemingway was also a poet and he always wrote in pencil, because even if you write in pen, it'll look too good. And we used to worry about not typing it up until it was at a stage where you could elevate it that way. And now a lot of people go right to the computer. And that's something that I resist. So I revise on the computer, but I start with pen and paper in a sketchbook with drawings. And there I'm linking it to my other art form that I pursue.
Yeah, I always write longhand, and it has to be a simple notebook and it's unlined paper. So I feel I have a certain kind of freedom. It is a blank page. I don't like lines. I'm making the lines. I don't need lines on my paper. But I would say that I am very connected to visual art, even though I didn't read any of the ekphrastic works. So looking at, I've painted a little bit, but I would say it's more, I think I'm inspired to write by looking at visual art. That is very inspirational for me. And I would also say that I love singing. And I always read my work aloud. I think it's really important to do when you're writing. I'm not writing and reading it as, that, but once it's down and once I begin a revision process, I'm always reading it aloud, and I am looking for a certain kind of musicality to the lines. So I think both the visual sense of, thinking my connection to visual art, as well as my connection to singing and to voice, are two of the things that are important to me when I'm writing.
And mine is definitely bookmaking. Every poem I ever write, I cut up into little texts, and I have these little booklets that I make, and I carry that book. So I do draft it by hand, but sometimes I do draft on the computer on the screen, but I have to, like, I'm an oldster, I have to print it out and have it printed on the page. I cut it up, I put it in these books, and I carry these little booklets around with me and revise in this little booklet, but it's physical, right? It's physical and manual and visual. So that's a kind of a parallel craft that I have, and a little bit of collage also, and watercolor. I watercolor as note taking, but anyway, I think many of us are connected to the visual arts.
Elaine sends very elaborate greeting cards.
Miller, what about you?
I'm thinking I don't really have a parallel practice, but I'll say that sort of like Stephen, I really need a lot of alone space to work. I really I can't work in a cafe. I need to know that nobody's going to hear me. I need to pace. I need to talk out loud often, like in terms of getting rhythm. But having an interlocutor on the page really, really helps me. And so working on the translations really fueled my original poems in ways that I hadn't expected, but really, really helped me. And in my new manuscript, I'm working with there are these sort of interjections from an unpublished manuscript of my father's. So I'm sort of translating that in a way, but I have just found bringing other voices in has really helped me. And especially if I'm like stuck, I'll just try to translate some Old English, and it distracts me, I guess, in a good way.
I meant to mention, Miller, before I read my little tiny Sappho homage, that your little riddles, your translations of those riddles felt very Sappho-esque, those little fragments. Those were beautiful.
Loved them.
Really beautiful.
Along those same lines, Miller, we got a question specifically for you about if you could talk about what drew you to the Old English and your experience translating those poems. Hermione said they're mysterious and they're evocative. And maybe you could just speak a little bit about that.
Sure. Thanks for that. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, they're so beautiful. I first I started being interested in Old English as a graduate student, partly by accident, because I was trying to sign up for poetry classes and there weren't any. And so I saw that there was a poetry class about this book called Piers Plowman, which I don't know that I can recommend. Piers Plowman, but it's like a really bizarre Middle English epic text. And I didn't know that it was in Middle English. I was like, oh, it's a book of poems. And I idiotically signed up for the class and got sort of sucked in. And then I realized, and then I started taking Old English and started translating Old English poems. And what I really discovered was that as an English speaker, I didn't know that much about the history of my language, and that I was a writer who didn't know that much about my own language, and that concerned me. And I also felt the poems were just like gorgeous too. So there was that, but beyond that, I sort of, it's a very, medieval studies is still a very conservative field that folks are working really hard on changing that right now. Amazing medievalists are working on stuff now, but I felt like who gets to decide, like who gets to translate this, who gets to talk about this work? Why should I, as like a queer Jewish like trans person, not be the one to look at this work and talk about this work? And so that's kind of where I started. But I'll just say one more thing, which was that reading a lot of the translations, what I saw was that most of them were translated either by poets who are working off a crib sheet from someone, a medievalist who spoke the language, or they were translated by medievalists who didn't know that much about poetry. And I sort of found a gap where there was something that could be done that hadn't been done. And I think it's really worth looking for things like that, because there's a lot of stuff out there that is beautiful and meaningful and important, that we don't, that maybe hasn't been done and can be.
Great.
Yeah, if you're going to be inspired by it through translation, by a work in another language, if you try to be too faithful to it, you might end up being inhibited. So you have to get it, I think, from the creative perspective, into a free place where you feel that it's just a starting point rather than what you're aspiring to, unless you're actually doing the translation and it has to be the best representative of that work in a book in another language. But there's such big differences between Italian and English that it's sometimes really inspiring not to feel too faithful to the original.
Well, didn't Robert Lowell do imitations?
Right. So that's what an imitation.
Montoys.
Right. He has a whole book of those. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will say I've done translations, excuse me, from Catalan most recently. I'm not sure if it's helped my own poetry, but I felt like I found somebody with whom I feel a kinship with. And it's just been great. I mean, again, if at times you're daunted by the blank page and you don't know what to do, sometimes, I guess this is advice I would give, try translation, because you don't have to be inspired to sit down and to translate a poem. It's an entirely different thing. You have something that you're beginning with. You have a source text. So at times I've really enjoyed that process. And I'm sure that there are ways that it has fed my own work as well. Because I have loved doing translation.
I just realized that something I said might be construed as a sacrilege, though, because we've got great translators here right now, including Michael Palma, who does amazing work translating from the Italian. So, but I think you really have to have such a gift, and it's best that you be a poet yourself in your own right, and also really understand the original and know both languages extremely well. So you have to have a lot, but for your average person looking for inspiration doesn't need to have all that equipment in place, all those abilities and skills. So.
Well, thank you all so much. And thank you for your generosity with our audience thank you all for your wonderful work. Please, all of you, tune in on Wednesday for our Slappering Hall Press reading. Please don't forget to go to your computers and order the latest books by these wonderful poets, as well as the Stronger Than Fear anthology. And we are so happy to have seen all of you here tonight. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Miller. Thank you, Sharon. It was really wonderful to hear your work and to hear you talk about poetry and translation to our audience. So we will send you the chat, and we will send you the list of people who signed up. So you'll know that they will all get to see the recording of the reading at the end of our season, so as not to deplete from your readings that you're still doing from these wonderful books. Thank you all so much. See you soon.
Great. Thank you.
Bye. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.